Okay, cool. So as you all know, in our previous session, we were discussing and reflecting on the existing body of literature and practice, as well as reflecting on the background research and discussions that we've been having before this convening. It was a very interesting, intriguing debate, and I hope we all continue with the thorough engagements in this section. So in this session, we really intend to take the conversations even further. We want to interrogate how we push these existing boundaries and incorporate some insights that we got from the pre-convening research that we conducted. In our interviews, many of you had hoped that the convening would start building a shared language which speaks to the intersection between economics and human rights. So participants noted that the biggest obstacles in bridging these gaps was that people in the different fields can't really work together because they speak a very different language. Like for example, economics can be very technical and human rights practitioners don't know how to decipher it and really bring it into their work. Similarly, human rights is often seen as being very legalistic. And so there's this general desire that we have some theoretical grounding to the conversations we're having during the convening in order to take it further. So in the session, we will have two speakers. We'll start with Allison, who is a human rights practitioner, followed by Gilad, who is an economist. And they will share some insight on how we build this shared language. They have done a lot of research on the intersections between economics and human rights, and will be able to help us identify some of the obstacles and opportunities in bringing these disciplines together. So in their presentations, essentially they're like provoking us to identify the existing boundaries and to try and find ways in which we push them further. So they'll each have 10 minutes to present, and then it'll be followed by like a Q&A afterwards. If you want, you can start sharing your questions in the chat room. So yeah, but because this session is very short, we prefer that you keep your questions directed towards the presentation so that we can have a deeper discussion in the next session, which is going to be in the breakout rooms. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to hand over to Allison to initiate the discussion.
Thanks so much, Pam. And I think just one other request of the rest of the participants during these inputs as well is if anything is raised during the remarks that surprises you or makes you think differently or is kind of a key takeaway, to also use the chat box to just reflect on that as well, because that's, I think, a really important part of what we want to capture in this session. But as Pam said, this is really just a prelude, a first act in order for the main course, which is another breakout session where we'll dive into more of these questions about how do we start building a shared language with which to speak about the intersections of these two disciplines. And so I'm framing my remarks very much as just some initial ideas or some food for thought that we can take forward in the discussion in the second part of this session. So I'm going to share 5 ideas, 5 thoughts as to how we might start building a shared language for talking about the intersection between human rights and the economy. The first one, which I think is important, is recognizing that human rights are a multi-dimensional concept. We can see human rights as moral claims, we can see human rights as political demands, and we can see human rights as legal obligations. And unpacking each of those ideas a bit more, what I mean by saying human rights are moral claims is that human rights give force to universal values such as dignity, equity, and justice. They're an assertion that there are certain needs, including certain material needs, that are so essential for human beings to flourish that they have to be guaranteed to everyone. As political demands, human rights argue for the prioritization of people's well-being when making hard choices and trade-offs about how policies are designed and how resources are distributed. And in this way, they're a tool that can be leveraged to build people power in political debates. And as a legal obligation flowing from international treaties, but also from national constitutions and other legislation, human rights call for compliance with binding rules and accountability when those rules are broken. I think in saying human rights is a multidimensional concept, it's not a matter of picking up one or another of these dimensions. The concept of human rights gets its power from each and draws different aspects of power from each. So if you picture a kind of Venn diagram, you can imagine the moral, the political, and the legal dimensions intersecting in the middle. What we've seen, though, is a tendency to overemphasize the legal dimension, and that can tend us to get stuck in some debates, as we did in the last session. And I think one of the ways to get past some of those sticking points is if we're more strategic in thinking about, where in the Venn diagram, at which point are we focusing our efforts in specific contexts. So the second thing that I want to suggest is that we need a deeper understanding of the political economy of human rights law. In other words, the legal dimension of human rights. And a promising analytical framework that can help us do that and can help us understand the significance of constitutionally protected rights is in an emerging area of scholarship that takes the name law and political economy. So a political economy approach to law argues that law effectively sets the rules of the game of economic struggle. And these rules operate on two levels. On a procedural level, legal rules can configure the basic conditions for bargaining. And on a substantive level, legal rules affect the relative bargaining strength of different groups in society. And I think this bargaining perspective, this bargaining concept, can be really useful in seeing how the human rights standards and principles that we work with regularly in the human rights space can shape the relationships between different groups in society. So starting with kind of the procedural rules, we see that conditions for bargaining are shaped by human rights principles that require decision-making to be reasonable, a standard that's heightened in context where rights are under threat, and also that decision-making be participatory, that it be transparent, and that it be accountable. Substantively, the bargaining strength of different groups is shaped by human rights standards that entitle everyone to the material conditions essential for our well-being. This includes both conditions of life and conditions of work, i.e. human rights links both the spheres of production and the sphere of social reproduction. And that was a theme, I think, that came up a bit in the conversation on Monday. In particular, socioeconomic rights guarantee that essential services such as healthcare and education are accessible, affordable, and of good quality, that opportunities for decent work are available, and that adequate living standards are achieved. They set a floor, though, they don't set a ceiling. In international law, their full realization must be progressively achieved. So this demands continuous improvement and continuous expansion of living conditions that are foundational for thriving. It also means prioritizing the needs of disadvantaged groups facing systemic and intersectional forms of discrimination. And really critically, and I think this second part doesn't get enough attention, these entitlements impose corresponding obligations, primarily on government, but not only. These obligations can be broken down into three levels. There's a duty to respect people's rights, which effectively means treating people fairly and humanely in decision-making. To protect people's rights, which means taking action to prevent, investigate, and punish abuses committed by others, notably the private sector. And so the regulation of the private sector and the constraints around corporate power are very much part of the human rights framework, even if the state is the primary duty bearer, to use a legalistic term. And third, there's a duty to fulfill people's rights, which means taking steps to facilitate access to the goods and services that are necessary to realize rights, including by providing them directly. And importantly, governments must take steps to the maximum of their available resources to fulfill people's rights. This sets parameters around how governments raise, allocate, and spend money, which kind of explains why there's been such a big focus around budgeting when it comes to looking at the relationships between human rights and the economy. And to me, this bargaining concept is a helpful way to think about the normative architecture of human rights, because it puts it in the service of struggles for concrete improvements in people's daily lives, rather than seeing them more as just abstract legal concepts that we need to expand and flesh out. You know, it's quite common to hear slogans like healthcare is a human right or labor rights are human rights. You know, it's less common to really hear clear and compelling explanations of what these slogans mean in terms of who has to do what to realize these rights. And so I think seeing legal obligations as a starting point, but then translating them into tools for framing popular demands can strengthen the political dimension of rights, which I outlined earlier. So the third thing, I think, that where we can start to build a shared language and we can start to work together more effectively is if we build up confidence to contest economic orthodoxies, particularly outside of the economic sector, if that's the right word, the economics discipline. So there was a question on Monday about whether human rights effectively act as a trump to other policy objectives. What we found in our own work at the Centre, that at least in the context of macroeconomic policy, the real trump is the need to preserve stability. So for example, CESR has been working with a group of Egyptian academics and researchers and activists since 2013 in an effort to document the really deep social costs of fiscal consolidation measures that have been part and parcel of loan conditions and policy prescriptions adopted since the Arab Spring. In our interactions with the IMF in particular, the message is a very clear, well, these measures are necessary. There is no alternative, to borrow Margaret Thatcher's phrase. And unless we build up literacy in the human rights movement and build up the knowledge and skills necessary to interrogate those claims, it's a really effective way of shutting down a conversation. And so pushing past that, I think, is an important area where we can bring together human rights and economics. The fourth thing I think we can think about is painting a clearer picture of what it looks like to center human rights, in particular socioeconomic rights, in the economy. And I want to propose 3 ways we can do that. First, I think centering human socioeconomic rights can help reframe what the economy is, who it's for, and how we should understand its success. And I saw that theme come out in the notes in the earlier session today. I think centering socioeconomic rights is an inherently redistributive agenda that sees guiding economic activity as a legitimate and expected role of the government. In particular, in providing public goods and essential services that deliver for everyone, not just those that can afford them. In redistributing resources to support care work performed in households, including through comprehensive social protection schemes. And in regulating the conduct of the private sector, both the financial and non-financial sector, to protect the rights of workers, consumers, and communities affected by their business. Centering socioeconomic rights also helps redress some of the disparities of influence and power in decisions about economic policy. Some of the procedural norms I mentioned earlier can establish new participatory processes or help create a more level playing field in existing processes. And the fifth and final idea I want to put forward for discussion is that we need to visibilize and popularize radical approaches within human rights activism. You know, I think it's not a coincidence that the human rights norms that have the greatest redistributive potential are also less developed and less widely championed than others. You know, governments have been given a much greater margin of discretion when it comes to scrutinizing the human rights impacts of their economic policy decisions than they have in other areas. And in the background brief and the discussion on Monday pointed to some of the reasons for that, linked again, I think, to the overemphasis on the legal dimension of human rights. But we see, for example, an over-reliance on formal accountability infrastructure like courts and international bodies. We see a siloing of expertise through the professionalization, and as someone put it, the NGOization of the field. And we see too a depoliticization of rights in an effort to increase their authority and their legitimacy amongst those who hold power. The organizers of the event were reflecting a bit after the webinar on Monday about the fact that there seems to be kind of less clearly defined schools of thought within the human rights field as compared to the economics field, where you have orthodox versus heterodox, Marxist, Chicago, Keynesian, feminist, etc. But I think it's important to stress that the field isn't a monolith either. It's really a kaleidoscope of different approaches undertaken from a range of very differently positioned activists and advocates, and that these approaches continue to evolve and interact over time. I think there's much to learn from the more eclectic, and as some people have described, even promiscuous way that social movements use human rights in creative ways to build power. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Alison. Gilad, you can proceed.
Excellent. Thanks, Pamela. And thanks, everyone. I'm going to focus a little bit less on the idea of a shared language and the more of a little bit on unpacking what I see as some of the opportunities and obstacles. I'm going to answer 4 questions, or at least try to give some answers. I'm putting those into a chat. Sorry to interrupt the very fruitful conversation going on there. And the 4 questions, and part of my input is to, in particular from the point of view as an economist, is to unpack some of the ways in which I think both economics and economic policy making provide obstacles and to the use of human rights. And Paulo's point is well taken, because there is an important distinction between the discipline of economics and economic policy making. And in some ways, I'm going to move from the economics to the economic policy making. So I'm going to ask, what would it mean for economics to relate to human rights? Why is it that both economics and economic policy making don't use human rights as a guiding framework? What opportunities there are, and what do we really mean when we speak about economic policy in this context? So what would it mean for economics to relate to human rights? Well, here I would take as a starting point, out of those 3 areas that Alison mentioned, the ethical of the 3 which he mentioned, which is the ethical, political, and procedural. And Amartya Sen, for instance, a well-known development economist, and this is how I begin to talk about human rights with other economists, right? Where Amartya Sen says, it is best to see human rights as a set of ethical claims, which must not be identified with legislated legal rights. We have to judge the plausibility of human rights as a system of ethical reasoning and as a basis for political demands. Now, this is, of course, not to say that the legal codification of this ethical basis is neither essential nor that it does not provide opportunities and possibilities for advancing and advocating for that ethical basis. But at least when I start to talk to economists about human rights, it is on this ethical basis. And I would contend that most economists somewhere in their mind have this there. If you ask people, well, why does the economy need to grow? People might say, well, so that people can get employment. And then you're like, well, why do we want people to have employment? Okay, so they can get income. Okay, well, why do we want people to have income? So they can have a house and have food. Well, why do we want them to have a house and have food? Well, because like they have a right to have house and have a food. Okay, and so you get to that point when you're engaging someone on a kind of intuitive level, but bizarrely, you don't get to that same point when you're engaging them on a theoretical and a disciplinary level. And my argument is going to be that poses significant challenges for using human rights in economic policy making. And it's bizarre because economics as a field really comes from ethics. Even Adam Smith, who's invoked as the kind of forefather of free market thinking, sees moral standards as being central to what the economy is about. So what happened? Why is it that economics and economic policy making does not use rights then as its guiding framework? Well, what happens in economic theory is that sort of chain which I've explained, from growth to employment to income to food and housing, actually works in a different way in the way which we teach and learn in economics. And what it really goes from is, we want certain economic outcomes like economic growth because we're advancing something called welfare, okay? And welfare within economics is understood, and I'm not going to go through the kind of technicalities here, but as maximizing individual utility, okay? And this occurs when a market equilibrium is formed in conditions of perfect competition with individuals acting rationally. Now, I know that paragraph violates all of Dirk's rules about jargon, but the point being made there is that economic theory conceives of the aim of economic outcomes to be the achievement of this notion of welfare. And welfare is the aggregation of individual utility, and that aggregation and maximization occurs within environments of perfectly functioning markets, okay? And that's a very different conception of both what economic outcomes we're aiming for and how we actually arrive at those points. Now, there's all sorts of problems with this, okay? What is utility? Okay, no one can really adequately explain that. Is your utility and mine commensurate? Is it just about the most utility? Well, what about inequality and the fact that, you know, I have lots, but you have a little bit, and all sorts of other problems with this welfarist foundational notion of economics. Within this system, rights are invoked only instrumentally, okay, to the extent to which they help create a framework through which this form of welfare is advanced. And in particular, it is property rights, which are invoked there. Now, this has all sorts of important consequences. This creates systems of economic thinking which center the individual, in which self-interest is seen as a good in itself, which are market-centric in how you maximize positive economic outcomes. Now, why is this relevant? Okay, why say this when half the room is human rights lawyers or advocates? Because without caricaturing, because no economist, you know, draws necessarily absolutely from this theoretical framework, but when you're sitting there having a conversation or an argument with an economic policymaker, they are arriving at that point as an economist, if they are, with a training and a paradigmatic approach, which has approached the world in this way. And that means it's informed their metrics of what good economic outcomes are, and it's informed the ways in which they understand you achieve those. For instance, through allowing markets to operate smoothly and efficiently without interruption. And so rights maximization is neither a targeted outcome nor a motivating factor in human behavior within the economic paradigms with which economic policymakers enter the room. And this as I said, can have very real consequences. And I'm going to give you a example here. I was involved with others in the implementation of a national minimum wage in South Africa. Now, the implementation of a national minimum wage, instituting a wage floor, violates the idea of leaving things to occur on a market basis, right? Where your wages are not set by government imposing that you legislate that there is like a national minimum wage, but rather that the optimal outcome will evolve through this market-centric process. And you can see there, or I hope you can see, depending on how clearly I've managed to explain this, that the types of theoretical and paradigmatic approaches with which economic policymakers enter the room gives them a gut resistance to the idea of implementing a national minimum wage. And a national minimum wage would give effect to various rights of decent work and so on. So it frames their way of thinking. But not only does it frame their way of thinking, but it frames the various tools which are used. So the types of economic models which we use are actually built in a way which are biased towards these theoretical frameworks. So those economic models show that the implementation of a national minimum wage would cause untold economic harm. In a tweet this morning, and no, it isn't Trump that I am quoting now, it is Jason Hickel, economic and anthropologist, said, imagine what economic theory would look like if its basic unit of behavioral modeling wasn't an abstract bourgeoisie male individual, but instead a mother. And I think that sort of captures in some ways these biases which I've been referring to. I know I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm going to rush through these last two sections. Okay, so what might the benefit of centering human rights as the legitimate endpoint of what the economy should be aiming for? Well, this would both impact our policy, but it would also impact our theory. It would disrupt what Allison called these economic orthodoxies by forcing us to think in new ways. It would highlight the shortcomings of the current economic system and allow us to envisage other and alternative systems. It would allow us to potentially audit economic policy choices which are out there. And it would allow us to flesh out an economic policy agenda. Lastly is, what are we speaking about when we speak about economic policy? And Lindo Kuchler's point here is really important, that we're not simply speaking about the allocations of budgetary resources. And that's really important. But I think that human rights advocates and those of us in the broadly human rights world have a default towards the notion of budgetary allocations when thinking about the merging of economics and human rights, because it's in the last decade the most well trodden, it's the most fleshed out, including from various covenants and so on. And we also have a default towards speaking of forms of social provisioning like healthcare or education or so on. But what we need to think about is what would it mean for financial market policy, as Danny's work, for instance, explores lending practices to individuals or restricting banks from financing environmentally harmful industries. What would it mean in labor market policy? What would it mean in industrial policy? Ruth Hall's here How do we think about the intersection of rights and securing a conducive environment for small scale agriculture through industrial policies, social security, and so on. And actually, and this is the last point I'll make, in making that list, I didn't actually find it that easy. And I've spent most of 2020 at some point thinking about this. And I think that that points to the fact that the boundaries, it's really actually difficult to think about what the spheres of economic policy making in which rights can impact beyond what we're currently impacting are, and giving concrete expression to say industrial policy in this instance impacts with rights in this way is something that I feel actually hasn't occurred to the extent which we need to. I'm now going to read in this chat to see whether that was understood and of use, hoping that the answer is yes. Thanks very much.